So, good morning. Welcome to Monday. I'm just going to say some good mornings, then we'll jump in. So, Miles is here. Good morning, Miles. Sophie's here. Good morning, Sophie. And Unadi is here. Good morning to you. Let's jump in. So, yes. This is actually back on Wednesday now, right? Because Thursday was a holiday and Friday was a quiz, so we're all the way back in Wednesday. So we were talking about Joseph Stalin, right, the shaper of the Soviet Union, and we said that he has quite a track record in the Soviet Union, right? He comes to power in about 1926 or so, and he's going to turn this country into an industrial powerhouse, right? So when he gets the Soviet Union, it's kind of backwards, it's struggling, agriculture is unproductive. And yet in a mere 12 years, he's going to make it into an industrial power, right? A power that can actually fight the Second World War effectively, right? Which again is very impressive and, almost unbelievable that he's done such a thing, right? But of course, it was done, in a very brutal fashion, right? And anyone who opposed him wound up in a forced labor camp, right? And a lot of things got built with forced labor, right? So a lot of forestry operations, mining, stuff like that was built with prisoners, right? With political prisoners. But one way or the other, he does it, right? He industrializes the Soviet Union. He collectivizes agriculture. He sets these massive targets for industry, which are completely ridiculous, except for the fact that he actually achieves them, right? And so again, in a mere decade, the Soviet Union is transformed from an agricultural country to an industrial one. Right. So in the process of this, of course, anyone who sort of didn't fit into a socialist system was removed. And so we said these kulaks, who were the wealthy farmers, the nepmen, which were the sort of wealthy business owners, they were basically just stripped of their land and sent to a camp or kicked out, right? Because they didn't fit into this Soviet system. We were reading last week a little bit on the Ukrainian famine or the Ukrainian genocide, however you want to define it. We said that this is a genocide in the way that Stalin sort of imposed living conditions that sought to bring about the physical destruction of these people, right? He basically took the harvest from Ukraine, he took all of the grain, he sealed the borders, and just left the Ukrainians to starve, right? And many millions did. And so again, this was his attempt to, of course, feed the cities, right? Because he wanted to feed industrial workers, but also to kind of punish the Ukraine because Ukrainian farmers weren't really cooperating with his collectivization efforts. Sorry, I'm just gonna throw on my jacket because it's actually cold in here. Yeah, the Ukrainian farmers wouldn't cooperate with his collectivization efforts, right? So he stripped them of their harvest and then sealed the borders and let them starve, right? Which again they did. So as you can see here, we're not really sure of the numbers because they didn't really keep track of the numbers very closely, but yeah, 7 to 10 million people, 7 to 10 million Ukrainians die in the process. And this is over a year, right? So again, compare that to the Holocaust where Hitler executes about 7 million people over the course of 4 or 5 years. Stalin has that many die of starvation in a single calendar year. But that's not all, right? There's going to be more deaths as well. So the kulaks are going to die, the netmen are going to die, anyone who opposes Stalin's collectivization efforts is going to die, the Ukrainians are going to die, and now we have the Great Purge, right? And so Stalin kind of goes through the Communist Party, he goes through the army, and basically removes anyone that he thinks will oppose him, right? And so here you can see Oh, sorry. Yeah, so his approach, of course, is this, right? Death solves all problems, no man, no problem, right? And so during this purge, you can see that hundreds of thousands of people are arrested and executed simply for not agreeing with Stalin or being perceived as a threat by him, right? And so pretty brutal stuff, right? We said that, of course, in 1939, the Soviets and the Germans are going to sign a non-aggression pact, right? So they're not going to attack each other. What's what? NKV, oh. That's a good question. And I don't remember what it is, but I'm going to look it up. NKVD. Yeah. The People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, government department of Soviet Union, was the law enforcement agency which did the will of the All-Union Communist Party. The NKVD underwent many organizational changes between 38 and 39 alone. I guess it's like an internal police service, if you will. Yeah, I guess it's government police, if you will. Good question, though. Right, so the non-aggression pact is going to get signed. We know that Hitler is going to stab Stalin in the back on this one, but they're going to agree to it anyway. And we also said that Stalin is going to wind up on the cover of Time magazine, right? Not once, but twice, right? In 1940 and in 1943. Again, this doesn't mean that he's a great human. It just means that he is newsworthy, right? And he's certainly very newsworthy in the 1940s. And that kind of brings us to the Cold War, right? Because once we get into 1939, we know what happens with World War II, right? We know that the Soviets are initially allied with Hitler until Hitler attacks them, and then they ally themselves with Great Britain and the United States. We know how that war ends, and so that brings us to right back to about 1945, right? And again, most of the second half of the 20th century will be defined by the Cold War here, where we have two, I'm going to go to this actually, kind of two broad powers, right? The USSR and the US trying to kind of, I guess, contain or combat each other, right? And so communism and the Soviet Union wants to spread their influence and sort of take over other places, and the US is attempting to keep that from happening, right? We read this last Wednesday, I think. It was a kind of a big chunk of the text, but I'm just going to jump actually to this. Pretty quickly after the war, a lot of things started happening in Germany, right? Because in Germany, that's where the Soviet Union and the US are kind of squished up against each other, and that's where the conflict is going to occur, right? So we said even from the beginning, they weren't sure about what kind of Germany they wanted. Again, France and the Soviet Union wanted a weak Germany. The US wanted an economically strong Germany. And in a way, both parties kind of get their way because, as we said, they split Germany right down the middle, right? And so, again, the western part of Germany will be economically strong and self-sufficient. The eastern part of Germany will be economically weak, right? So it's kind of the Treaty of Versailles all over again, but in this case, both parties get their way, right? So we said that there was some early conflicts between the US and the Soviet Union, once in Iran, where the Soviets don't want to leave and the Americans want to convince or have to convince them to. And then some confrontations to do with Greece and with Turkey. And that leads President Harry Truman to issue this Truman Doctrine, right? And so he says here that the U.S. is going to, there it is, to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. So this is huge, okay? It's a short quote, but this is huge because this is the beginning of the U.S. kind of turning around and saying, and becoming a different kind of country, right? Rather than a country that is isolationist and kind of tries to mind its own business, now this country is going to get involved, right? And so if the Soviet Union is threatening another country, or if communists are threatening a country from the inside, the U.S. is going to be there, right? The U.S. is going to intervene. Huge, 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 huge. We also talked about the Marshall Plan here, the idea that Senator George Marshall said that, you know, the best way to keep communist revolutions from happening is to ensure that countries have strong economies, right? And so George Marshall here gets this passed where the U.S. provides economic support to European nations, right? Both in the West and the East. Of course, Stalin will say no for all of the Eastern countries, but Western European countries take the money, right? And it does help. It helps to move their economies along. And again, when your economy is good, people don't really think communism, right? When the economy's bad, that's when it starts to look good. And then finally, we talked about the Berlin blockade, right? So we said that, hang on one second here. I just want to check my slide number. Right. Right, so we said that Berlin is that little white dot in East Germany, right? And the US and France and Great Britain, they have a presence in that city, and Stalin eventually wants them gone, right? Because again, it's looking, good morning, it's looking good for West Germany, right? West Germany is, their economy is recovering and people are getting jobs and making money, and things are not looking so good in East Germany. And so Stalin decides that's it. The Allied powers said they were going to leave. They're not leaving. I'm getting rid of them, right? And so what does he do? What happens in the Berlin blockade? No, there's no wall yet. There won't be a wall until 1962, I think. Yeah. Yeah, so he basically closes the road and the rail lines into Berlin, right? So now they can't get any food, they can't get any fuel, and all of the things that they need, they can't get them, right? And so Stalin basically holds Berlin hostage and says, you guys get out or everyone's going to starve, right? And so Andre, what did the Western powers do?
Oh, they help Berlin providing other stuff, food and everything by air.
Yeah.
I think 4 countries help. Was it Ukraine, the US, France?
Probably. It's probably mostly the US that does it. But yeah, the others probably help out for sure. Yeah, so they supply Berlin by air, right? And so, again, for an entire year, there's a plane landing like every 4 minutes in Berlin, dropping off supplies that the people need, right? Which is incredible, right? And probably would have cost a mountain of money, but they do it, right? Because I don't know if it comes up in, I don't think it comes up in the text, but you know, they said at the time, what happens in Berlin happens to Germany, and what happens to Germany happens to Europe, right? And so you can see the Western powers are like, if we let him win, right? If we let Stalin kick us out of Berlin, the next thing is he's going to be trying to kick us out of Germany, and then he'll be trying to kick us out of Europe, right? And so the U.S. here makes a really strong stand and says, no, we're not leaving, and you're not going to starve these people out, right? Which again is pretty unbelievable, right? That level of interventionism is pretty impressive. Let me just go back here. Yeah. So again, Stalin tries to cut off the supply lines to get the Allies out of Berlin. The U.S. supplies Berlin for over a year, and finally he has to give up, right? He sees that it's not working, and he opens the roads again, right? So, oh yeah, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because this is a... Sorry, let me just look at one more thing here. Right. So that kind of takes us to the very earliest phase of the Cold War, right? And so the World War II is over, and there's a little bit of, I said it's like a boxing fight, So at the early stages, if you watch boxing, maybe MMA too, I'm not really sure, but the fighters are kind of testing each other out, right? A few little punches, a few little jabs. They're kind of feeling each other out and kind of, testing each other a little. And that's what's happening here with the Soviet Union and the US. They're just kind of testing each other, right? And so, Stalin's trying to find out, well, okay, what if I don't leave Iran, right? Will anyone say anything? And the US said, yeah, they did say something, right? And they convinced Stalin to leave, right? Stalin was trying to interfere in Turkey, and again, the U.S. stood up and said, hey, this is the Western sphere of influence, get out, right? Stalin tried to push the Allies out of Berlin, and the Allies kind of stood up and said, no, we're not leaving, right? And so you can see these little test punches, right? Just to see what the other one is going to do, right? And I think that they're right about Berlin and Germany, that if Stalin was successful in kind of bullying the Allies out of Berlin, that he might have tried for more, right? He might have tried to push them out of Germany as well. Okay, so I have a little bit more for you to read here. This section is going to talk about, what's it going to talk about? It's going to talk about NATO, I think. Oh yeah, NATO and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and Korea. Right? So this is as things start to kind of settle out, we're going to start to see a few military alliances form, but we're also going to see the first actual conflict of the Cold War, which of course is going to occur in Korea in 1950, okay? But I'm going to give you some time to read this, and then we'll talk about these few questions, okay? All right. Put some time on the clock here. Oh, I'm just going to make sure that it's in Microsoft Teams. It might not be here. 183. Okay. Readings in Microsoft Teams there, so you can go to it, okay? You realize you're looking at the wrong one?
Yeah.
Which one are you looking at?
175, 196.
The what?
175 to 196.
It's 175 to 1. Oh. Sorry, which one are you looking at?
I think the one on Wednesday.
The one from Wednesday? Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Okay. Oops. Oops. Why did who?
So the Berlin problem is always that it's a place where you can really see the difference between the two sides, right? So like imagine you're in West Germany, right? And it's their economy is doing well and everyone's wearing nice clothes and driving cars and going to work.
Is that because of the location or because of some
No, well, no, it's because of capitalism and because of the help that they're getting from the United States. But then you walk like literally across the street and you're in East Germany, and because of the way the Soviets are running communism there, it's everything is kind of crappy and nobody's wearing nice clothes and there's no money, and so it looks bad, right? Like for Stalin, it looks really bad for his side of the street to look poor and crappy.
So it's more because of
Well, it's not so much the geography is weird because Berlin is inside the Soviet half of Germany. So he's got his enemies right inside his territory. And so it looks bad, but he also wants them out. But they won't leave.
Alrighty, Roo. Okay. Can we talk about a few of these things? Is that okay? All right. So, what's the deal with this NATO thing? You'd probably heard of it before, but what is it? Yeah. So North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? And it's a military alliance, right? Meant to sort of contain the Soviet Union, right? So everyone is kind of nervous that Stalin might eventually try to roll into one of these Western European countries and take it over. They're all pretty small, right? They're all pretty weak against the Soviet Union. And so they kind of unite together, right? First with the Treaty of Brussels, and then later a bunch of other countries join in as well, right? And so, of course, the important one is Canada. No, the important one is not Canada, although we're part of it as well. The important one is the United States, right? And so once the United States is in, that helps to protect Western Europe against any threat of, the Soviet Union entering into Western Europe and taking it over, right? But it's interesting how they're pointing it out, right? There's kind of a political side and an economic side and a military side, right? So there's kind of the Truman Doctrine is the political thing, that they will intervene in countries that are threatened by the Soviet Union. There's the economic thing, which is the Marshall Plan. And now there's the military thing, right? There's NATO to keep the Soviets out. And you can see the Soviets kind of develop the same thing, right? They have Cominform, which is sort of a political thing to help coordinate Eastern European countries with the Soviet Union. They have Comecon, right, which is not Comic-Con, which, everybody goes and, Comic-Con, right? Never mind. So it's not that. To help kind of economically coordinate Eastern Europe with the Soviet Union. And then they have, what's the military thing for the for Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union? Nope, that's the political thing. Yeah, so as kind of a counter to NATO, Stalin creates Warsaw Pact, right? So all of the Eastern European countries, actually I'm just going to go to that here. Right, nailed it. All of those Eastern European countries, they're going to be allied with the Soviet Union, right? So an attack on any one of them is an attack on all. Do you think any of those countries had a choice of whether to sign on? No. Stalin told them to sign and they did, right? But so they're all in a military alliance, and now, of course, NATO is in a military alliance as well, right? An attack on one is an attack on all, right? And everyone will come to defend. So yeah, we have this kind of political thing going on, economic and military coordination, kind of on both sides of the Iron Curtain, right? Let's see. There's where we were. There's NATO. Oh yes, Tito. What's the deal? What's the deal with Tito in Yugoslavia? Yeah, he's the leader of an Eastern European country. You can see Yugoslavia there. It's in white, and he doesn't seem to want to listen to Stalin's orders, right? How does he kind of defy Stalin? What kind of things does he do that Stalin doesn't like?
He ruled his country with his own way.
Yeah.
Like even
Yeah, so Tito is a communist dictator himself, right? But he's not one that listens to what Stalin says, right? And they mention Crazio, what were you going to add there? Say it. The Hydra. Okay, okay, that's okay. So he is a military or he is a dictator, right? Tito is. He is a communist, but they mention that their communism doesn't really come from.
Oh yeah, it doesn't come from the Soviet Union itself because like he only fight back the Nazi when it's only become a communist country.
Yeah, yeah. So Tito's kind of a war hero, right? Yugoslavia beats the Nazis on their own, right? The Soviets don't help them, and so the people like Tito, right? They think he's a cool dude, and so Stalin, of course, says, "Oh, here's a Eastern European communist country. I will control it with my iron will," right? And Tito's like, actually, we're good over here, right? We don't need to be told what to do, right? And so Tito's kind of doing his own thing, right? And what does he do? He proposes like an economic union with Bulgaria and Albania, right? Which Stalin doesn't like. I think, I might be wrong about this story, but I think at one point Stalin sends an assassin to kill Tito, and Tito catches the assassin first and kills him. And I think he sent a letter back to Stalin and said, next time send a professional if you're going to kill me. So I don't think Stalin liked that very much either, although I might have gotten the story a little wrong, but apparently Tito kind of survived that as well. But yeah, so Tito doesn't really listen to what Stalin has to say. What is it about Yugoslavia's geography?
It's like there's the Mediterranean Sea and it's between the communist and the capitalism party, between both of them. So maybe they're kind of safe because like they have the support of the U.S., so they're not afraid to attack by the USSR.
Yeah, it's not like poor Poland, right? Poland is well inside the Soviet sphere, right? And there's no help for them. But Yugoslavia is kind of on the border, right? Like just across the across the Adriatic there is Italy, which is a NATO country, and they're kind of just on the line, right? And they're separated. They don't have any border with the Soviet Union, and so Tito's got a little bit of a buffer zone, right? He again is just not interested in following Stalin's orders at all, right? And again, part of that is because he's geographically separate. Part of it is that he happens to be just a really good leader. And as we'll find out, he's kind of holding Yugoslavia together right now. And when he dies, Yugoslavia will kind of fall apart because he's the guy who's holding it all together. Yeah, he's just not interested in listening to what Stalin has to say. And of course, Stalin will kind of finally give up on him, right? But of course, Tito will be only too happy to connect with Western countries, and the West will, help support Yugoslavia. So, yeah, Yugoslavia is kind of a weird country in this kind of situation. Nope, one more. 15 and 16. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. What is this NSC 68 thing? What is that?
It's a pact that allow U.S. are giving financial support to the allies country.
Say that one more time.
It's like a pact that allow U.S. to give the financial support to the allies country.
Nope. Not quite. Not quite. quite. There's a financial component to it, but it's not. It's not that.
Always lack of funds to support a massive military build-up to fight against the Communist Party.
Right, right. So NSC 68 is a paper, right? So it's a paper that's written by members of the US government, and they're basically outlining what needs to be done, right? And so what they're doing is they're identifying that, look, we have a big problem here, right? We have a big, powerful country who, you know, it seems is bent on just taking over the world, right? And so somebody has to stand up and oppose this other, this group, right? This country. And it seems like the US is going to have to do it. And so in order to stand up to the Soviet Union, we're going to need to be prepared militarily, right? And we're going to need to spend a lot of money getting our military up to, you know, up to capacity, right? This is it identifies the US as a global policeman, right? And so this is kind of an important thing for the US, right? Now the US spends a ridiculous amount of money on their military, right? I don't know what the, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars, it's insane. But that starts right here, right? That starts with NSC 68 and the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the US saying, look, somebody's going to need to stand up to these guys, and it's going to be us, right? And we're going to spend the money to make our military the strongest in the world, right? And it still is, right? It still is, but it is that way because of this, right? Because of this NSC 68 paper and the US government deciding that the way forward is for them to have the biggest stick, if you will, right? Let's see. Oh, okay, and then the Korean War. I want to talk about the Korean War, but maybe we'll wait until we get back. Do you want to take a little break? Yeah? Okay. Let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about Korean War, okay? Okay, and we are back. So again, we're kind of settling into the Cold War here, right? So we had the Berlin blockade and you know, Turkey and Greece and Iran, a few little test punches, and now we're kind of settling in, right? The two sides are settling in, and so there's sort of political and economic and military events on both sides as kind of Western Europe and the US kind of settles into their rivalry against Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, right? So the sides are kind of set here, alliances are created, and then, alliances are created, and in, you know, with that NSC 68 paper, we're going to see, you know, the US step up, right? The US sort of commit themselves to being, you know, the defenders of democracy or the opposers of communism, right? And again, that's going to, you know, that's all on paper, right? That's all just words until 1950 when we get a conflict in Korea, right? And how does this whole thing kind of get started? How does this Korean War thing get started?
Started when North Korea wanted to invade South Korea with the armies, and the US want to like support the South Korea because there's a tons of like reason that US support South Korea.
Yeah. So we know that in so how does so when this whole thing starts, Korea is already divided in half. Yes. Yeah. And why is it divided in half?
I think it's just like it is already separated to a communist party and a capitalist party.
Yeah. Well, it's already divided. Yeah, because that's who liberated them at the end of World War II, right? So the Soviets had liberated the north half and the Americans had liberated the south half. And so because, of course, neither side wanted to leave Korea entirely, they decided to split it down the middle, right? But then along comes Kim Jong-un's dad, right? Kim Il-sung, right? And Kim Il-sung says, hey, I think I can take all of Korea if I can just get some help from my friends, the Soviets and the Chinese, right? Because the Chinese are recently communist, right? Mao will declare the People's Republic of China in 1949, which we'll get to. And so with kind of support from Soviet Union and from communist China, Kim Il-sung decides, hey, I can do this, right? I can create a communist Korea, right? So he, of course, invades the South, right? And unfortunately now the US has to respond, right? So Truman just finished saying that they would, you know, support people who were being subjected to outside forces. And then here we have South Korea being subjected to an outside force, right? So the US is kind of forced to step up here, and they do. They get some help from the United Nations, but we're fighting, right? We're fighting this war. So really, this is kind of a war between the Soviet Union and the US, but it's kind of fought through the Koreans, right? And so what do you know the word for that kind of war? It's kind of like two big powers, but they're kind of fighting through two smaller powers. A what? A puppet war? That's not the term, but that's the right idea. No? It's what? Oh, well, puppet war is not a thing, although I would watch a puppet war. But puppet war is not a thing, but proxy war is. Yeah. So this is, a proxy is when you're kind of, you know, when you're doing something through someone else, right? So sometimes you can have proxy voting, right? So if I'm eligible to vote for something, but I can't be at the meeting, I'll give my vote to Mark, right? And Mark will be my proxy vote. He'll vote for me, right? So here we have a proxy war, right? Two big powers, the US and the USSR, fighting it out through two smaller powers, right? Through within Korea. How does this war go? Did you read far enough to see how this war kind of plays out? How's this war kind of go?
Last for a while.
What's that?
Last for a while.
It does last for a while, right? It's not a short war. It's going to go on for 2 years? 2 years? 3 years?
That they provided the Soviet Union USA because sending army to Korea. We all know at that time the Soviet Union some weapons and some go to China and then China to go to the Korea.
Yeah.
And USA just like send some weapons to the why don't they just use their own to
That's a good question, right? So in North Korea, we know that the Soviets are kind of supplying some technology and some money. I don't think, if I remember, there's no Chinese troops fighting in the Korean War initially, but they're ready, right? So that there's Chinese troops just across the North Korean border, kind of ready to support North Korea. And the U.S. is kind of aiding South Korea, but craziest question is, why don't they just like pull out the big guns, right? Why don't they just fight it out?
Because once the U.S. and the USSR like send their own troops to like Korea and then fight a war, they're like having a real war. They're not like it's not gonna just have a cold war like showing off their powers. I know in that period like they both have the atomic bomb.
Bless
So
you.
they don't want to like make the war happen to use the atomic bomb to end the war.
Yeah,
So that's when they were afraid that they cannot control that situation.
exactly.
If they use their own army to fight, it might have the worst news and things.
Yeah. Things are going to get real dangerous between the U.S. and the USSR, right? Because as you probably read, the USSR will successfully test its first atomic bomb in 1949, right? So by the time we get to Korean War in 1950, both sides have nuclear weapons, right? Both sides have an atomic bomb. And so, things are going to get real dangerous, because if Soviet troops start fighting American troops, now you're in a real war, right? Now it's a big conflict where both sides have atomic weapons, and it's going to be ugly, right? And so, it's kind of like, at the beginning of the Cold War, there were these little jabs, right? But, now, like, both sides realize that they're so big and powerful that if they start, swinging, it's going to be hugely destructive, right? And so what do? Well, they kind of back off, right? And they start kind of fighting each other through other powers, right? Or through kind of more covert ways, because once they're having a war, they're having a real war, right? And it's going to be super destructive, right? So they'll engage in a bit of a proxy war. I do like puppet war, actually, but it's a proxy war. Puppet war is not a real thing. They do engage in a proxy war here, and they'll keep doing it, right? All the way through this decade, they'll be involved in Vietnam, in Cuba, in a bunch of Central American countries a little bit later on. The US and the USSR will continue to kind of oppose each other, but through proxies, right? Because it's safer that way, right? Okay, so they're engaged in this kind of puppet war, and I think if I recall, the North is actually almost successful. Like, so they move in and they basically conquer almost all of Korea. They take Seoul, for instance, and they almost get all of it before the U.S. and their allies start pushing back, right? And so I think, if I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Americans kind of push the North Koreans out of South Korea back onto their half, and then they continue on, and the West almost takes the rest of North Korea as well. And at that point, there's a bit of a almost a scandal, because the guy who's in charge of it, General MacArthur, he actually wants to attack the Chinese, because the Chinese are kind of waiting across the border, and MacArthur has gone all the way into, we don't have a map, has gone all the way into North Korea and says to Harry Truman, hey, look, if you give me the go-ahead, I'll take the fight to the Chinese too, and I'll end this thing. And Truman's like, nope, don't do it. If you engage the Chinese, then we'll be fighting them and then the Soviet Union, and it's too much, right? It'll get out of control. And so they have a big disagreement, and Truman actually fires MacArthur, because MacArthur's saying, no, I want to end this. And Truman's saying, no, you're not going to end it. You're going to start World War III here. And so basically what happens at the end of this is that the Western powers kind of retreat behind that 38th parallel, that division, that original halfway point, and then they sign a ceasefire. And that's where we are today. So North and South Korea have a ceasefire agreement from 1953, I think, and that's it. So in theory, they're still at war. They're just on a timeout. But nothing has really happened in that regard, right? And so, of course, Kim Il-sung passed away, and his son Kim Jong-un has taken power. South Korea has continued to develop with a lot of support from Western allies and from the US. But that's kind of where we are, right? So the current situation in Korea really comes out of this sort of period, 1945 to 1955. Weird. Is there anything else we should say right now about what's going on kind of in the early 1950s in Europe or in Korea, the development of the successful nuclear test by the Soviets? What else? Is there anything else that should come up here? Okay. So we've talked about NATO, right? It comes out of the Treaty of Brussels, right? And then a few more countries sign on another year later, and it becomes NATO, right? Which still exists, of course. President Trump was whining about how most countries don't pay their share into NATO, but that's probably true. We said that, it was, this is a significant agreement, right? Because it shows military alignment between all of those Western nations, right? That they'll stand up to the Soviet Union. I've got a little typo there, that involvement doesn't have an E. Again, it's strengthened the American commitment to Europe. And of course, it showed them that was kind of the first step, right? Because the Soviets, if they're going to expand, they're going to expand into Western Europe, right? And once they start to do that, then they will threaten American security, right? So the Americans are really invested in protecting Western Europe from Soviet Union, and will continue to do that for the rest of the century. We read this, I think, not today, but we read this on Wednesday. The outcome of Czechoslovakia, right? So Czechoslovakia had sort of democratic elections. They kind of got half communists and half Democrats. But when some of the government started to lean toward getting Marshall Plan aid, Stalin intervened, right? So one of the guys I think wound up in jail. The other guy committed suicide, right? Which of course he did not. And they sort of installed people who were loyal to Stalin and the Soviet Union, right? So Czechoslovakia had some elections. They didn't, excuse me, they didn't come out in favor of, people who would listen to Stalin, and so Stalin had them replaced, right? We talked a little bit about Yugoslavia and the fact that Tito wasn't having any of Stalin's drama, right? And so, again, Yugoslavia manages to escape Soviet control, but of course, other Eastern European countries will not be so lucky, right? Here's NSC 68, the beginning of the U.S. military buildup, but also the role of the U.S. as global policeman, right? And the country with the biggest military in the world, which I think it still is, right? Yeah. Yeah, and then the Korean War here. So, again, we see the U.S. having to get involved in this conflict because they just committed to defending people. And again, in a way, nothing really changes, right? A lot of people die, a lot of money is spent, but Korea starts out the Korean War divided and ends the Korean War divided at the same place, with the communists in the north and capitalists in the south. And so, unfortunately, again, a lot of people die, but not much really changes from before to after. And even to today, we still have that same situation in Korea, right, where it's divided in half. Okie dokie. So I hate to ask you to read a little bit more, but I do have a documentary to show you, but I want to just clear up a few more things before we dig into it, okay? So I'm just going to give you 5 minutes here, okay? And whatever we can get done in 5 minutes, that's what we'll deal with, okay? Because again, I don't want you to just be reading all class. So read this section. I'm just going to make sure that it's in Microsoft Teams, and then we'll just go through what we're able to. We'll deal with the rest tomorrow, and then again, I have some film to show you, okay? So there we go. That's in Microsoft Teams. Yeah, so just start that page at the Khrushchev era, okay? Khrushchev? Yeah. The first part, the KH is more like a K in Russian. The center part, actually that SHCH is actually one letter in Russian. But think fresh cheese. That's how it sounds. Fresh cheese, Khrushchev. What's that? You can't see 197? 93? Oh, okay, hang on. I think. Oh, okay. Maybe it's only 196 we need. Oh no, it's not. Okay, don't worry about those for now. We'll add them in later. You're right, though, Crazio. Say again?
What is the question number 25?
I don't know offhand. I'll look at. We'll deal with them later. Yeah. Okay, so just to tie up today, as you can see, Stalin has died. Sad, right? Well, I don't know. I don't know how sad it was. I think most people in the USSR probably were like, oh, like, Thank God that's over, right? Because, yeah, he's terrible, right? Everybody has been living in a state of fear for decades, right? People who opposed him got sent to labor camps, right? People who were, who he felt threatened by, they wound up in jail or executed, right? This guy has been, conducting a reign of terror for decades, and finally he is dead, right? And so who's going to kind of come to power to replace him? Mm-hmm. So this guy Nikita Khrushchev comes to power. Khrushchev is kind of a different leader than Stalin, right? At the 20th Party Congress, big speech, Khrushchev gives a speech that I think is about 3 hours long, shockingly. Yeah, he could go for a long time, I guess. But he has kind of 3 themes in his speech. And what's one theme? Yes, not a theme of the speech, but he is going to reform agriculture. Yeah, but before that, in the speech, there's 3 themes.
De-Stalinization.
Right, de-Stalinization, right? So the country has been running this sort of reign of terror style of government for quite some time. And again, everyone is like breathing a sigh of relief, right? So now we want to continue on, but we don't want to continue on the same way, right? Living under Stalin was terrifying and brutal, and we don't want to do that anymore, right? So Khrushchev is kind of doing a couple of things, right? He's saying, what Stalin did was remarkable, right? It was unbelievable. He, turned this country around from a poor agricultural country to an industrial superpower with an atomic bomb, right? Unbelievable. But also did some bad things as well, right? And so Khrushchev tries to kind of comfort everyone, right? By saying, yes, Stalin did some amazing things, but we're not going to continue to do things the way that Stalin did, right? And he's also trying to kind of comfort some of the people who worked with Stalin, right? Because, yeah, lots of people were executed under Stalin's watch, and people around Stalin are the ones who did the executing, right? So Khrushchev is saying, Stalin did some great things. We're not going to keep doing things that way, but we're not going to actually, we're not going to go after everyone who was associated with Stalin either, right? We're not going to start throwing people in jail because they helped out Stalin. We're just going to move on, right? So, if you were an accomplice to Stalin, just relax. We're not going to try and throw you in jail or anything, right? We're just going to move on. What's the second thing? Second theme?
He said that there's many ways to achieve socialism.
Yeah. And what does that kind of mean in practice?
Like, it means like he wants to establish a stronger, like, ties with the other country.
Yeah. And so how's he going to do that? How's he going to establish a better relationship with these other countries?
With some like establish more socialist parties.
Well, the socialist parties already exist, but this many roads to socialism kind of means that there's a bunch of different approaches, right? You can have socialism in a bunch of different ways, right? And so how people kind of interpret that is like, he's not going to tell other countries what to do as much as Stalin did, right? So in Eastern Europe under Stalin controls everything, right? Now it's definitely a puppet thing, right? All of the governments are puppets of the Soviet Union and of Stalin, right? But Khrushchev is saying, you know what? You can have socialism in lots of different ways, right? Countries can kind of do things a little bit differently, but still be socialist countries, right? And then there's a third theme. What's the third one?
Third is like
Right. Why is the developing world becoming important here?
Something about like
So, what's kind of happening here in terms of global politics?
split two part,
What's that?
split it to two part.
Definitely, right? So there's kind of two teams, right? There's the Soviet Union and the US, right? There's two sides. And there's also a kind of a decolonization movement, right? So a lot of colonial powers like Great Britain and France and Netherlands, they're actually getting out of their colonies, right? They're kind of seeing that, oh, they really shouldn't have been doing that. And so they're kind of pulling out of, of India and lots of African nations. India is going to become a country here in 1948? I forget if it's 48 or 49, but India will become independent. Pakistan will be created very shortly after. And so there's all these new countries that are either appearing or becoming independent for the first time in a long time, right? And again, there's two teams, right? So you got to pick a side. Whose team are all these new countries going to be on? And Khrushchev says we should be connecting with these new countries and trying to get them on our team, right? And so that's important too, right? So they're recognizing the importance of all of these sort of countries that are newly formed or at least newly independent. He's saying there's many roads to socialism, and so he's not going to be as much of a dictator to other countries as Stalin was. And he's saying, we're just not going to do things the way that Stalin did them, right? It was brutal and awful, and many people died. That's not the way we roll anymore, right? So Khrushchev is going to be a little bit different, right? Okie dokie. So that is all for today. Tomorrow, come back. We'll tie up this section, and then I've got some film to show you from the time, okay? Some primary and secondary sources, if you will. All right. That's it. I will see you tomorrow.